Welcome to the Disability Etiquette training hosted by Opportunities for Ohioans with Disabilities, which we refer to as OOD. My name is Dustin Schwab, and I'll be your presenter for this training. I work in the Division of Employer and Innovation Services and serve as a career development specialist for the Ohio College to Careers program. As some of you may not be familiar with OOD, I'd like to provide a brief explanation of our agency. OOD is Ohio's vocational rehabilitation agency, and it exists to help individuals with disabilities find competitive, integrated employment in the community. Simultaneously, we serve employers as they look to diversify their workforce with qualified employees. The individuals we serve have two things in common: a disability that presents a barrier to gaining employment and a desire to work. They work with an OOD vocational rehabilitation counselor who provides the services they need to get or to keep a job. Our agency partners with a network of provider agencies who employ staff like job developers and job coaches to help a person get a job and be successful at work. OOD's business relations specialists form strategic partnerships with employers to help them fulfill their hiring needs. More information about our no-cost services for businesses can be found at our website at ood.ohio.gov/employers. So let's start by sharing what a disability is. The ADA defines an individual with a disability as a person who has a physical or mental health impairment that substantially limits one or more of their major life activities. And those activities could include a person's ability to see, hear, walk, care for oneself, learn, think, and communicate. The ADA also defines an individual with a disability as someone who has a history or record of such an impairment, or a person who is perceived by others as having such an impairment. So, why is it important to talk about respectful interactions with people with disabilities? It's important because people with disabilities make up the largest minority group in the country, and they are made up of our family members, friends, neighbors, colleagues, customers, and could very well be you or me, because it is estimated that 1 in 4 Americans will acquire a disability at some point in their lifetime. So, let's take a look at this picture. I'd like you to consider each of these individuals and decide which of them has a disability. So, how many of them would you guess has a disability? The answer is that the number of people with a disability is unknown. Most of you probably noticed the woman who uses a wheelchair as someone with a disability. And some of you may have questioned whether the man wearing glasses could have a disability. Each of those could be considered a visible disability, but most disabilities are invisible or not immediately apparent. Examples of these could be chronic fatigue syndrome, epilepsy, diabetes, or attention deficit disorder. Whereas you can see a person who uses a wheelchair due to a physical disability or someone using a cane because they are blind, you may not know if a person has a disability such as a traumatic brain injury, learning disabilities such as dyslexia, and mental health disabilities such as anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress or bipolar disorder. It's estimated that 10% of the US population has a medical condition which could be considered a type of invisible disability. Now, employees are not required to disclose a disability at work, and since many of those disabilities are not visible, it's very likely that each of us are already working with people with disabilities. So, what are the rules for disability etiquette? It's simple. Behave in the same courteous and respectful manner with a person with a disability as you would with anyone else. Most importantly, concentrate on the individual and not on the disability. The more you do that, the less significant the disability really does become. Okay, so now let's break down several different types of disabilities, and I'll share some recommendations for respectful interactions with people with each type. Let's start with physical disabilities. When you interact with someone who has a physical disability, it's important to treat them as you would anyone else. For example, if a person has an artificial limb, offering your hand is an acceptable greeting. Use your left hand to shake hands with someone that does not have a right hand or has limited hand use. And if someone is unable to shake hands, you can gently touch that individual on their arm during your introduction. If a person has a cosmetic disfigurement, it's important to maintain eye contact with that person. If this is an issue for you, you can focus on their forehead, which will still give the illusion of direct eye contact. If a person doesn't appear to show interest or excitement, it could be a result of a neurological condition, a developmental disability, or it may be a side effect of a prescription drug. A flat affect does not always mean that someone is not excited, motivated, or capable. Before we move on to discuss respectful interactions with a person who uses a wheelchair, let's hear from Jacqueline.
Important to let somebody in a wheelchair take on the wheeling themselves, because that's their way of moving in the environment. So if you take control and just do it on your own, then you're taking that away from them. So definitely do not grab somebody by the back of the wheelchair and start pushing them without either asking them first or them asking for your assistance. You're speaking with somebody and they're standing, it can be a little awkward. If it's a long conversation, it's nice when people can actually sit down and be able to sit and talk at eye height with me. But if it's something brief, saying hello, that's perfectly fine. But leaning in, depending on the circumstances, it can be kind of demeaning.
In addition to the recommendations that Jacqueline provided, here are some other tips. Be conscious of the personal space of someone using a wheelchair and avoid leaning over that person while shaking hands or having a conversation with someone else nearby. It's okay to use phrases such as, "let's walk over to the conference room," or "she's running late." They're common phrases in our language and would not be considered offensive. And it's always a good idea to keep accessibility in mind, not just for that person's work area, but for any part of your business, such as restrooms, break rooms, the parking lot, and meeting areas. So let's talk about respectful interactions with people who have mental health disabilities. Because mental health disabilities are typically invisible disabilities, they are often less understood. So some things to keep in mind are they are real health conditions, just like cancer, diabetes, or heart disease. There are a range of mental health disabilities. They can occur at any stage of life to anyone, and the symptoms vary from person to person. Some examples of mental health disabilities are depression, bipolar disorder, anxiety, and schizophrenia. Remember to treat people with mental health disabilities as you would want to be treated yourself. Be careful to avoid speaking in a condescending way or making decisions for the person. Try not to make assumptions about the person's wants, likes, or needs, and never disclose someone's mental health disability to others without asking the person for permission first. There are many different types of mental health diagnoses, and each person is affected differently. Please avoid blaming the person. Someone with a mental health disability can't just snap out of it. And finally, remember to focus on the person instead of the mental health disability. So next, let's talk about interactions with someone who is blind or has low vision. Something to keep in mind is that the term legally blind is used when someone has 10% or less of their vision. So a person can be legally blind, but still have some vision. Let's hear from both Jeff and Katie, who are blind, regarding disability etiquette.
I'm just like you in a lot of ways. There are many more ways that we are similar than that we are not. And so I remember when I went into classrooms, one of the most common questions was, well, so what was it like adjusting to going to college with your disability? Was it like learning how to read all the textbooks and to get around the campus? And I said, well, you know, not really. Those are things that I've lived with my disability my whole life. The hardest part about going to college for me was doing my own laundry and getting up on time because mom wasn't there anymore. I think it is very okay to ask me questions, and actually I would prefer that. If people are unsure, of how to interact with me, asking questions is the best answer, because I'm probably the only one that really knows the best way to interact with me.
If you do see a person who is blind and they're traveling with a guide dog or a white cane, please don't touch those devices unless the person gives you permission to do so. We all love dogs, but they're doing really important work, and so the person who needs the dog is really, it really is a team effort to work with the dog, and so that the person who's using the dog is really relying on the dog to keep them safe.
Here are some additional tips when working with someone who is blind or has low vision. When approaching the person, immediately identify yourself. You can say something like, "Hi, my name is Dustin. Nice to meet you." If you wish to shake hands, you can say something like, "May I shake your hand?" And this will let the person know to extend their hand for you to take. Of course, you will also want to let the person know when you are stepping away, as the person may not always have the visual cue that you have left their space. And finally, it is okay to use phrases like, "Do you see what I mean?" or "Did you watch the game last night?" Most people who are blind can hear fine. There is no need to raise your voice. It's okay to offer your assistance when moving to another location. If the person says that they would like your help, let the person take your arm and alert them of any obstacles along the way. If taking the person to a seat, simply place their hand on the back of the chair and the person will take it from there. Keeping doors and cabinets either fully open or fully closed is helpful, as a partially open door or drawer can be a hazard. Okay, let's talk about interacting with people who have an intellectual or developmental disability. Intellectual and developmental disabilities are disorders that are usually present at birth and impact an individual's physical, intellectual, and/or emotional development. Examples would be cerebral palsy, Down syndrome, and autism spectrum disorder. When interacting with a person with an intellectual or developmental disability, you want to be direct with your questions. Sometimes subtleties can be difficult for the person. It is important that you be patient and give the person time to respond. Remain comfortable with a break in the conversation. It may take the person a little bit longer to process what you have said and formulate a response. If you're asked to repeat a question, you can try to explain it in a different way or provide an example. For some people, providing information in the form of pictures can enhance their understanding. Autism spectrum disorder, in particular, is a developmental disability that affects how a person interacts and communicates with others. For example, you may find that some people with autism are very literal. As a spectrum disorder, there is a variance in functionality. People who have autism experience and display a wide range of behaviors and symptoms. So let's take a moment now to hear from Connor, who is a person with autism, regarding disability etiquette.
People think autism tends to have like a one symptom, but it's not. I mean, it's a variety. Like some people with autism have certain behaviors and others don't. One of the things I do is like hand flapping or like reciting words and phrases that I hear on like TV or something, which basically leads to like why people with autism tend to have trouble communicating is social awkwardness. I've been in so many situations where I mean, I don't mean to come off in the wrong manner, but people take it the wrong way because it's just something it's just how my brain processes. I can't control it. That's another thing with autism, is not being able to understand other people's emotions. If you look at a pond and you see a line of ducks just swimming across, they may seem like they're going really, really slow, very smooth, but underneath that water, they are kicking them web feet as hard as they can. That's kind of like what goes on the inside of me. So people don't see what goes on. They judge me based on like how I act or like what I say and stuff, instead of like getting to know who I really am. And that's been a really tough part about my life with communicating with people. One of the toughest things that people would say to me is that they call me retarded, which infuriated me, because like people thought that I was below human, like I was being treated kind of like a robot. Like I can't understand emotions like humans can. Like robots can't love, or they can't understand emotions and stuff, and that's what people viewed me like. When I was younger, my my neighbors and I used to hang out, and we would go swimming in our pool. So I one time asked them, I was like, hey, you want to come swim? It's like, yeah, sure. So they were walking into the house. They never came back. And I stood there for a long time. I fall for what people say. It's one of my weaknesses with communication. I would say the best way for a person to communicate with a person with autism is to get to know like what they like and like how they act and then like sort of come down to their level. If you get like an attitude or something, or you do something like if you touch them or something, they overreact like, what are you doing? So you got to make sure like how that your communication skills are at the same level as they are, so or else it's not going to go so well. The way, please do not call them retarded, please, because people use that all the time, and it infuriates them. It's like it's basically, I take it like it's offense to my intelligence, to my abilities to do things like others. They think I can't do these things. So I feel like people need to get to know a person with autism before jumping to conclusions. You'll find that they can do a lot of things that people without autism can't do.
Here are some additional tips for communicating with people with autism. Always presume competence and let the person talk to the person directly. Avoid assumptions that someone with communication challenges cannot understand what you are saying. Many individuals with autism display repetitive behavior, so you may see them doing or saying the same things repeatedly. Try to overlook these repetitive behaviors the same as you would ignore someone twirling their hair. Don't take it personally if a person with autism responds to you bluntly or makes a frank comment. Respond in a straightforward manner that explains why the response was inappropriate and guide them to a more appropriate response. So now let's talk about interacting with people who are deaf or hard of hearing, and start by hearing from both Karen, who is deaf, and Sean, who is hard of hearing.
So a few years ago, I bought my first plane ticket on my own. I'd flown a few times, but this was the first time that I bought my own ticket. I bought the ticket online and I was asked if I had a disability. I don't typically think of deafness as a disability, but I went ahead and put down that I was deaf. When I arrived at the airport, there were people there waiting for me with a sign that had my name on it, along with a wheelchair. Well, I don't need a wheelchair. All right. So then I got on the plane, and while they were doing the standard takeoff procedure, they gave me a copy of it in Braille. But I'm not blind. I can read. I just can't hear. So that was really frustrating for me at that time. Some people who are deaf can lip read. I can read lips, but it's not 100% perfect. Many people talk in different ways. The way they move their mouth differs from one person to another. It takes time to get used to how some people will talk. But you won't be able to catch everything that's said. If someone wants to interact with a person who is deaf through the use of lip reading, speak slowly, clearly, and make sure to enunciate your words. Gesture and use body language, that helps as well. If a person who can hear is meeting with a person who is deaf, I'd advise them not to yell. If that person already can't hear you, yelling at them won't help with anything. All it really technically does is allow other people to know that that person can't hear you. And by yelling, your frustration is emanating throughout the area. And now that conversation is not private anymore.
Impaired means damaged, and hard of hearing people are not damaged. They have most have their own culture. They know ASL. They can do everything that hearing people can do except hear well. So don't use that word.
Some ways you can get an individual who's deaf their attention is that you can tap them on the shoulder. You would like to do it easily. You don't want to tap them too hard. If you tap them really hard, they might assume that you're angry, so just tap them easily on the shoulder. Or you can wave within their line of vision, or you can flash the lights.
Here are some additional tips for interacting with people who are deaf or hard of hearing. Avoid making assumptions about a person's preferred method of communication. It's best just to ask. You may get answers like texting or writing on a piece of paper. Some people who are deaf are hard to understand when they speak. If you don't understand what a person is saying, avoid pretending that you do. Instead, ask the person to repeat what they said or ask if there is another way you can communicate. Sometimes a person who is deaf or hard of hearing may be accompanied by an interpreter. When this happens, you will still want to maintain eye contact and direct the conversation to the individual and not the interpreter. The interpreter is there simply to transfer the information between you and the person who is deaf or hard of hearing. Be sure not to engage the interpreter by saying something like, "Please tell her I said, how are you?" Also, during a meeting or a presentation, it is proper etiquette to ask the person who is deaf or hard of hearing where they would like the interpreter positioned to ensure that that person can see the interpreter and the information being presented. Now that we've looked at some different types of disabilities and tips for interacting respectfully, let's take a look at some acceptable terminology and some terms that are considered unacceptable. It's best if you avoid calling someone special or handicapped. Instead, use the term disability. Avoid words and phrases with a negative connotation such as crippled, deformed, birth defect, and physically challenged. If it's necessary to address that person has a physical disability, you can simply say person with a disability. Using words like normal and able-bodied indicate there is something wrong with a person who has a disability. So instead, use the term person without a disability. You may hear people say that someone is confined or bound to a wheelchair, which indicates an inability to move when actually it's the reverse. A person uses a wheelchair in order to move in their environment. Use person first language by saying a person who uses a wheelchair. Instead of calling someone an epileptic, again, use person first language by saying person with epilepsy or person with a seizure disorder. Don't say cerebral palsy victim or spastic. Using the term victim has the negative connotation that something wrong has been done to the person. Saying that a person is spastic is defining them by a symptom they may have. Instead, simply use the term person who has cerebral palsy. Use person of short stature versus midget or dwarf. Instead of referring to people with visual disabilities as the blind or the sightless, say a person who is blind. Again, the proper language to use is deaf or hard of hearing person instead of hearing impaired or the deaf. The word impaired insinuates that there is something wrong with the person. You may have noticed that I did not use person first language for this one. There are some disability groups that prefer what is called identity first language, and the deaf community is one of them. I'll talk in a minute a little bit more about this. Terms like disturbed, crazy, and insane can be hurtful and offensive. A better alternative would be a person with a mental health disability. Instead of calling someone hurtful names like the R word, slow, or stupid, use person first language along with their particular disability. For example, a person with a learning disability or a person with Down syndrome. If a person has a speech disability, rather than saying speech impaired, say a person with a speech disability. And lastly, for our language do's and don'ts, there are two commonly used but outdated terms: special seating and handicapped parking. The more acceptable term is accessible. So earlier I mentioned that I was going to talk about the difference between people first versus identity first language. People first language emphasizes the person and not the disability. So for example, you would say a person with a disability versus disabled person. By placing the person first, the disability doesn't define the person. In general, this is the accepted way to refer to a person who has a disability. For people who prefer identity first language, the choice is really about empowerment. It says the disability isn't something to be ashamed of. It's common for deaf people to use identity-first language, but you may also meet people who are blind or have autism that also prefer identity-first language. Examples of identity-first language are deaf person, blind person, and autistic person. If you're not sure what language to use, just ask the person what he or she prefers, or avoid using the disability altogether. So instead of saying my deaf coworker, just say my coworker. We're nearing the end of our time together, so I'd like to touch on a few closing thoughts. We've talked quite a bit about different types of disabilities, respectful interactions, and even heard directly from people with disabilities about their preferences and experiences. I hope the information shared today helps you overcome any fears or misconceptions you may have had about the best way to interact with people with disabilities. In short, people with disabilities want to be treated with the same respect you would afford anyone else. Remember, the person with a disability is your best resource. If you don't know what to do, just ask. Concentrate on the person's technical and professional knowledge, skills, and abilities, experiences, and interests. And lastly, just relax and be natural. Thank you for joining me. For more information about how OOD can help your business recruit, hire, and support individuals with disabilities, or to meet with a OOD business relations specialist to arrange an in-person disability etiquette or disability awareness training, please visit the employers page of the OOD website at ood.ohio.gov/employers.